Okay, so nice to have you back. Um, so we're starting a new course today
Yeah.
on the Neoplatonic doctrine of the virtues. Let me share the PowerPoint. Um, hmm, there we go. Okay, so this is what we'll be dealing with in for the next couple of months. Not sure how long this will take. But the idea then is to go through the basic texts about the Neoplatonic doctrine of the virtues and to see how they develop the idea, especially of the ladder or scale of virtues. And so this is basically what we'll be doing. We're going to start with
Wow.
Plotinus on virtue, and then I'm going to see some excerpts from the life of Plotinus by Porphyry, to like illustrate like how Porphyry saw Plotinus as a virtuous person, and we'll look at different text of Plotinus on our guardian spirit, which is important because he has this idea that the guardian spirit, the daimon, is as it were whatever's next. Like, so if you live a life of the senses, then say, like the nous can be your daimon. But if you live a life on the level of nous, then your daimon is a god, right? So this step-by-step structure is really present in that essay on our guardian spirit. Then Porphyry has sentence 32 that's dedicated to the virtues. Iamblichus, we're going to have to take some selections, but especially it's going to be about this debate that starts with him, between him and Porphyry, right? About whether just philosophical training in virtues is enough, or rather, if do we also need theurgy, ritual? Then we'll look at Marinus's life of Proclus. Again, probably not the whole thing, maybe just some selections. Because the the life of Proclus is called by Marinus on happiness, because his point is to show that Proclus was the happiest person ever to have lived. And how does he show that? He shows that he had all the virtues, right? So this biography is actually a little treatise on like what's a perfectly virtuous life. Proclus again, we don't have one specific text on this. We'll have to look at a different at a selection. Then Olympiodorus has texts on the Phaedo and on the first Alcibiades, which are directly on the scale of virtues. And Damascus again has it in his commentary on the Phaedo. And as we go, I'll be bringing sources in Plato and Aristotle and others. So that's the basic idea. Now, with regard to translations, um, so here is Gerson and McKenna in the same part of On Virtue, right? So this is like the beginning of the treatise. So I brought the two things here just for comparison, just to make some points. So, actually, do you want to read these texts?
I could read them. I actually looked at them yesterday to see what's going on. Should I start from the left? Uh,
Sure.
yeah, so that's the Gerson one. Since evil exists in the sensible world and of necessity circulate in this place, that's a quote from somewhere, and the soul wants to flee evils, it should flee from the sensible world. What then is this flight? Plato says it is assimilating oneself to God. And this would occur if we were to become just and pious with wisdom. I guess another quote. And this is generally if we were in a virtuous state. Okay, so we have to escape the sensible world, and the escape is assimilating oneself to God. And to doing that means having the virtues or being just and pious with wisdom. If then it is by virtue that we are assimilated to God, are we assimilated to one who has virtue? So then the question is, does God have virtue? Moreover, to which God will it be? Because there's different ones. Would it be then to one who seemed to have those virtues more, that is, to the soul of the cosmos, and to that part of it which governs, in which there exists a marvelous wisdom? For it is reasonable. If it is reasonable that, because We live in the sensible world, which will assimilate themselves to this God. So whichever is the lowest one or the one who is the soul of the cosmos.
Right. So that was Gerson. Well, the translation coordinated by him. Now read the McKenna version.
Yeah. Now, since evil is here, haunting this world by necessary law. See, that's why I told you it's cuter. And it is the soul's design to escape from evil. We must escape hence, so escape from this world. But what is this escape? In attaining likeness to God, we read. And this is explained as becoming just and holy, living by wisdom, the entire nature grounded in virtue. So that's what the escape is. But does not likeness by way of virtue imply likeness to some being that has virtue? Right? To what being, to what divine being then would our likeness be? Because it has to be like, so you have to be like something that is like. So which one would it be? To the being must we not think, in which, above all, such excellence seems to inhere. That is, to the soul of the cosmos and to the principle ruling within it, the principle endowed with a wisdom most wonderful. What could be more fitting than that? What could be more fitting than that we, living in this world, would become like to its ruler?
Okay. So a couple of things. Uh, so yeah, as you said, there are quotes here. There are quotes from the Theaetetus. And as I said, the McKenna is cuter or more poetic, right? So here he has
Yeah.
haunting this world by necessary laws of necessity circulate in this place, right? So there's no law in the Greek. And so, and of course, haunting is, more general than circulate. And like circulate is also a bit um yeah, you can say it's a bit too exact, like petit pole. It's pretty exact. That's what petit pole means. But like what's evil circulate means it seems odd. It seems maybe like a too restricted term to say what evil things do. Um and right. McKenna does something nice here, which is that he breaks up, like when the flow of the argument when Plotinus asks his rhetorical questions, right? So he says, "But what is this escape?" It's a whole separate paragraph for him. And the Gerson's it glosses things, right? So there's no Plato says in the text. He it there's just he says, and so they supply Plato says, whereas McKenna just does we read. There are different translations choices. So what's here is generally here becomes the entire nature. And so there's two different ways of gloss of interpreting holos. I would generally with a more deflationary reading. We see here also the use of the use of capital letters, which I mean I myself do this when I translate to distinguish between, for instance, when I'm talking about the form of something and when I'm just talking about the thing. But McKenna seems to capitalize anything important, right? Likeness here is like all the like, even when it's not a noun, it's capitalized. Um, Now, so there are many like there are many differences, and there are reasons to prefer one or the other. But with the translation of some key terms, especially here in these texts, soul and virtue, they seem to be united. Although in the case of McKenna, now here he reverts to excellence, and that's something that McKenna does, that he doesn't always use the same translation for the same technical term. So also, I think further on, I'm going to quote a part of his text from 5.9, and I chose to use his translation since the one you have. And there he will go between, for instance, beauty and grace, both for kalos. And so McKenna has this proposal, which I like, right? That, you're translating the thing, the concept. And since the point is to get the concept across, you don't always have to use the same word. Um, but there will be parts where I think the Gerson translation parses the Greek better, although I have seen moments when the McKenna is the one that the sole one to parse the Greek correctly in mine eyes. I saw that in the um in the treatise on time. And I could check like French and German and English and other translations, and the only one really that I found really follow the text closely was McKenna. But the real difficulty for me for translation really is words like soul and virtue. Because we use them in ancient philosophy, and we use them amongst ancient philosophers who speak Greek. And when we say soul, we mean psyche, right? We just use it as a stand-in to for the Greek instead of having to go back to like leave English all the time. So for instance, you both of the translations will use intellect for nous. And of course, even though like Plotinus for nous for Plotinus is not some intellectual capacity, right, to understand certain kinds of things. And and then it just becomes like these code words that I think are the real challenge of translation. And the Gerson translation, although there are many ways, and it's profits from a century of scholarship, and is much more exact in many ways. Although it hasn't tackled these really difficult issues of trying to find a way to really bring Plotinus to the English language. It's still very much this this technical jargon that's good for ancient philosophers and perhaps for some other philosophers. Um, all that to say, there might be ways in which Gerson is better. There are ways in which McKenna is better, but I think that um, and I know there are other translations into English. So like there's the series that John Dillon is editing, but they're coming out like one volume at a time. And I haven't looked into those and what they're doing. But in general, the great challenge of translation, which is to get these philosophers out to the broader reading public, even if we restrict it to people who are curious about philosophy, this is like something that really still has to be done. All to say that if you want to use McKenna, use McKenna.
Okay. Uh,
Okay. And when it's relevant, I'll mention what Gerson does and things like that.
yeah. Can I make a comment or a question about
Sure,
the?
sure.
So I have this thought, like you're saying, like some words when people who are like in the field use it, they tend just to mean the original word, and it's not really meant to interpret in any way. It's just like a word that means that, and it's like traditional to translate it that way. And then, I mean, I guess the real answer to these kind of questions is to read the original, um,
Well,
or is
I mean,
not.
not necessarily. I mean, of course you can read the original, but then there's still the question of, understanding what you mean. Like,
Right.
I remember when I started reading Hegel in German, and then I would ask, well, what's the German behind this? And and really getting to the bottom of what these terms mean, it's not that you have to read the original necessarily. Of course, access to the original helps, but the main thing that helps is just reading a lot of the philosophy, right?
Hmm.
And then you'll be able to like find your own words for what these things mean. And
Right.
um, so for instance, because of that, like in my Proclus translation into Portuguese, I translated nous as providence, for instance, or I translated agathon as value. I'm now starting to translate Plotinus, and one idea that I am actually toying with regard to soul, not just in Plotinus, but also to Proclus, is that maybe psyche is best to actually translate it as life or vida, because soul brings with it, just it's in some ways very restrictive for us. We tend to think of it as this abstract thing that we don't really know and that's separate from us, and we tend to think of it as individual. Each person has their own soul, and when we say things like the soul is immortal, it sounds like this, I don't know, this claim about this special thing that we can't see.
Mm.
But if you translate it as life, right? And of course, you want to say something like substantial life, or maybe, life that exists on its own. But anyway, then if you say, life is immortal, my life is immortal, that's has a much more direct meaning. It's like when I die, like when this body stops functioning, the life in it will keep going, right? And that's something that's much easier to get a grasp on than the soul is immortal, right? And so there are things like that, but really the I think the key really isn't so yeah, I think like when you're reading ancient philosophy, one can be tempted to think, oh, I have to learn Greek and read the original to really have access to this. And that is important, right? Because for instance, I wouldn't feel comfortable to take these flights of translation if I wasn't working with the Greek text. But I think what really helps is just trying to um, getting to know the author's thought and trying to build the most charitable, systematic interpretation possible. And
Hmm.
really trying to find out what are the arguments, because it's the place of a term, of a concept in the arguments that will determine what its content is.
Right.
Yeah. Um,
So,
okay. Yeah.
so something I was thinking is I was comparing the way in which like me or we're taught in yeshiva about we read Hebrew and Aramaic, and the funny thing that is done is that they never teach you the language. So mo many people could like go through like 10 years or whatever of yeshiva and not know how to construct a sentence. In Aramaic, especially Hebrew people know better. And but what they do is they sort of like just translate, like even if you read like Art Scroll or modern translations, they always give you the original and translate line by line or word by word. And then somehow it feels like you have more access to the text, like versus when you're reading some book that's entirely in translation, you're like always reading someone's interpretation. And you see, you'll find these funny things like in some commentators where they're trying to figure out what a word in Aramaic means. So they're like, wait, we've read, because there's like Targum, right, with the Aramaic translation of the Torah. And they're like, wait, I know the Hebrew word, which is usually translates. So that's how you figure out backwards what words are supposed to mean. And I was thinking that this, and I started doing it for the guide of the perplexed, where like I could read the Arabic and the Hebrew letters, which is written in, um, and you can start to see, like without really learning the language, you just start to like
Mm,
feel like you have access. Like instead of learning someone who's already giving you a second hand, like we're learning like when you teach children, even when they teach children the Chumash in schools here, they don't teach them Hebrew. They teach them the words, they teach you how to read it, right? The phonics,
mm,
but they don't teach you a lot of the meaning. They teach you the meaning as you go along reading the text. And then somehow, I mean, some people understand and some people don't, but you get some kind of, like you're saying, the feeling of where it fits in the text. Like it's learning a language by a certain kind of immersion in the text itself.
right.
Sure, it's
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and kind of I think reading philosophy is kind of like that. Reading when you start to read any philosopher, you have to have a certain amount of patience where you're just going to immerse yourself, and then eventually things will make sense, because there's a time where
Mm-hmm.
you're just putting things in your memory, and eventually, oh, way much further on, then you'll understand what he meant. And but yeah, and often in philosophy we have problems also, like you go to the sure, you're reading the Greek, and the Greek has, and then you don't know a word, and then you go to the dictionary, and the dictionary gives you the meaning, but then it says to justify translating like that, it refers back to the passage you're reading. It's like, oh, well, obviously this won't work. And so there are those things, and yeah, there is a sense in which you're I mean that it's good to have the original next to you, and I mean I have the original next to me right now, but there it's doesn't clarify everything. Because I mean, otherwise, philologists would have taken our philosophers' jobs.
Right.
Um, and um, okay. Um, so though that's for preliminaries, let's go. Let me just raise some issues that we're gonna face while we're discussing virtue in general, like that we're gonna be talking about. So one thing is this term arete, right? Which can mean just excellence generally. And it doesn't necessarily mean the excellence of human beings. You can talk of, the excellence of a knife in cutting. And even human excellence isn't necessarily moral, right? So um Meno defines arete as, knowing how to benefit your friends and harm your enemies. And so you wouldn't necessarily think that um human excellence is moral. It's this moral, right, of course, this moralization of human excellence is, as it were, a project of Plato and Aristotle, right, and Socrates, like a project of the philosophers to show that if you want to be an excellent human being, or what's that, well, it's you if you manage to be a happy, right, a happy accomplished human being, then you're also going to be a good guy. And um and so against people like um Thrasymachus in the in book two of the Republic, or Callicles, who seem to think, no, if you want to be a happy flourishing human being, you have to be ignore justice, or think what, or do what's naturally just, which is just to what the which is like the law of the strongest and things. Um, and but this connection between virtue and happiness and virtue and the good is, as well as the philosophers point out, it's complicated. Because although it's as it were, something that you can easily get to accept, that what do people want? They want to be happy. What each person thinks is happiness is different. And there's also a distinction between, happiness is something that we enjoy. For some people, it will be like a state that we're in. You're happy. For other people, it's an activity. It's something you do and experience, right? And so it's ours, right? Happiness belongs to us, whereas the good is what we aim at. It's not necessarily what we belong to us, right? And they can have an existence separate from all things, right? That's the case in the Republic, and also in Aristotle's metaphysics. The good ultimately is the first unmoved mover, which is like a general of an army, right? Um and and this, is also what uh Aristotle addressed to Plato. Is like, you say that, the philosopher has to know the good itself, but how is that useful for the carpenter? How is that useful for us to become good human beings if we're interested in becoming happy individuals, right? And that's something that these questions are things that the Neoplatonists will be directly involved in. And in the passage that we started with already, we have this question of, is the model that we're assimilating towards, is it itself virtuous, right? And um, and then, if it's not virtuous, so there's a question of which God that Plotinus raises, because there's this um, polytheist background where when you say God, it's not really clear what you mean, right? It's whereas, in a monotheist context, when you say God, you can only mean one thing. You're referring to one thing. Whereas in a polytheist background, you use the word God or the word divine for many different things. So saying that something is divine or that you should imitate God has a wide range of meanings. So you have to specify it. And then there's a question of, um, how can it be useful to us, because it's in principle a different kind of thing than us. And I've been using us all the time, but that is something that really will change your virtue theory depending who you think you are, right? If you
Mhm.
think that you are the soul, then you'll think certain things are conducive to fulfillment and happiness. If you think you're the soul with the body, then the body will have you'll have to take care of the body for you to be accomplished and full and happy and so on. And if you think that that your true identity is, for instance, a god or something else, then, virtue will be something else and will be an entirely different thing. And in all this, one question that's, I wrote two papers on this question about the ladder of virtues um, in Proclus and the Neoplatonism, and especially on this question about the role of theurgy in in the scale of virtues, right? So, what is the role of prayer and ritual um, in becoming a better and more accomplished person? Is it necessary? Is it actually what characterizes the best people? And for me, the like one important question behind this is like, how can metaphysics be practical, right? And that's also part of what this theory of what the Neoplatonic theory of the scale of virtues does isn't is it kind of explains why is knowledge of the good itself or the gods themselves, why is that, useful for you? And behind this, there's this whole question about piety versus philosophy, which is more important, right? The piety appears already back here, right, in the Theaetetus prescription to flee the world. We'll take a look at this text in a moment, but it shows here, that this means becoming just and pious with wisdom. And this is actually something that then, you know, um, in Platonist literature, so including like Middle Platonists and so on, this idea that you need piety, so you need, to practice gratitude and give what you owe to the gods. This is an essential part of the good life is something that is constant throughout the Platonic tradition. And Christoph Helmich has texts about this. But like if you look at Alcinous and Plutarch and Plotinus and like the Neoplatonists, it's also very clear. It's clear that the piety is important, but then how does this relate to, as it were, self-knowledge and um, rationally seeking your ends and rationally seeking to build a contemplative life? That's an open question. Different people will have different answers to in this tradition. So those are just some initial issues that we'll be seeing many of these as we go on. Um, do you want to say something about where you're coming from? What's your interest in these issues about virtue?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
wanted to ask one question about one thing you said, or maybe we
mhm,
can elaborate on it later.
sure.
Um, the question about who are us, because I'm thinking about that. So, is there an assumption behind this question that says that virtue is a kind of way or a perfection of a thing? Like there's a virtue of a human, so it would depend on what a human is. Because if you have some kind of idea of virtue, like many modern people seem to think that the same thing that is good for us should be good for a God. Like
Hmm.
God needs to be good in the same way since we have like like a duty kind of virtue or some kind of thing that it's external to the good of the thing. Like so if it's good to do something, then God must be or any I don't know, any kind of being should theoretically be able to have the same kind of virtue. And like there isn't like one of the things you see is like and this leads to all kinds of messed up things, but like you see in many traditions, like a sage has different virtue than a regular person. He could do things that are bad for you, or that would be bad for you if you would do them, or the opposite, some things that are not bad for you were bad for him. And the modern, like sort of egalitarian, but it's based on some kind of view of virtue, seems to very much not even have a concept of that because it's like, well, what is good is just good and has nothing to do with the good of something.
Um, yeah. So So yeah, in general, this idea that a virtue is a disposition or a habit, and so it's something that belongs to something that has its own existence, right? One thing is to exist, another thing is to exist well, right? And so like existing well is somehow somehow dependent on existence, but on the other hand, there is also the view that in some sense, like Plato says that the idea of the good is the cause of intelligibility and being for all other things. And the the teleological project of the Timaeus, and that's taken up by Aristotle as well, is that you should explain things in the natural world by saying why it's good that they should happen. So the good has this explanatory priority. And so they're both kinds of, they're things pulling in both ways um uh in the tradition. It will see this especially in the Plotinus text on our guardian demon, on our guardian daimon or spirit, because there it seems like it's a call to, you should become something else, right? You should become a better, so you should become a better thing. And this is like, as it were, gestured in Plotinus, but later, in Pico della Mirandola, so Renaissance text that was influenced by the Platonists. There really is this idea that the human being can literally become anything in the world, and then there, it's clear that the good has to be prior to what you are, because what you are can change. Um, so, and there is so this it's funny, both of them ideas that you mentioned, the modern idea that there's a good for everyone, and the idea that there are good things, there are things that are good depending on who you are. Both of these are really present in Stoic philosophy. So the Stoics scandaled the Platonists by saying that the wise man can issue orders to Zeus. And of course, he will want exactly the same things as Zeus wants, because he's the wise man and Zeus is the wisdom of the world. But they explicitly said that the wise man can give orders to Zeus. And so they did have this idea of, in some sense, everyone is following the same laws, and even gods and human beings. But on the other hand, they also really emphasized that each person, given their state in life and their circumstances, has different duties, right? So, and has different obligations, and then also, like different things they can or can't do. Um, we saw a little bit of what this might look like actually when we discussed Proclus's interpretation of Homer, right? Where it's clear for him that like if you don't have the right philosophical training, you shouldn't be reading these myths, right? And because then they can be dangerous for you, right? And so things like that. Um, and you do have these ideas, especially what later in the Platonists where you have like a hierarchy of spiritual beings, and of course each of them will be able to do things that others can't. There's also an idea here, of course, that even in a more extreme sense, right? Because like the extreme sense would be that, oh, like the gods can objectively do something evil, whereas we have to keep to the rules. And of course that's like the Nietzschean way of putting it. And but Procla seems close to saying stuff like that, right? Where like, of course, for a human being, we have to be rational and we have to promote philosophy and reason and so on. But the gods, for the sake of the perfection of the world, they make sure to promote lots of irrationality too, which would be bad for us to do, but it's good for them to do. So that gets raised. There's also an issue about even actually like in the tradition, there's a debate about where are we with regard to the gods? Because, okay, like the first principle, unity itself, the good itself, of course, nothing is on that level. But is a human being, is he equal to the gods or is he always inferior to them? seems like in Plotinus, it's more in a case that we are in some sense an equal because we also have this intellectual side of us that's always up there. Whereas for the later Neoplatonists, there's a clear hierarchy that's never changed. Um, so so yeah, that's a whole set of questions that that gets raised, and yeah, that's all. Yeah, in that
Okay.
question of who are we? Yeah. Any other thing about
Yeah.
these?
So just the like when someone says if you want to be good, you must first know your soul or yourself.
Hmm.
That works within any of, I mean, within this framework. And like a Kantian framework, the only thing ethics implies about yourself is that you can be the subject
Right.
of ethics or something like that. Like it auto
Yeah.
implies can or something like that.
Yeah. There is. I mean, there's lots that's Kantian. There's lots that reminds one of idealism in in the Neoplatonists. Um, but and of course, the good itself is supposed to be, or value itself, in my preferred understanding, is supposed to be the cause of everything. But it's, yeah, I don't think that there really is a although there's like on the very general level, this priority, one could say, even of like ethics with regard to ontology, with regard to ourselves, we're in such a situation that ontology has to come first. Right. Um, and maybe I mean I guess it's true for the gods, that they are each of them a value and like a free value, and they produce their essences, they produce the ways that they're present in the world freely, and so they are, you know, the true existentialists, but we could also say that they're the true Kantians, in the sense that the good is prior to being for them. But for us, we first come to be and then we decide what to do about that. And so, yeah, self-knowledge is prior. This is in Proclus, at least. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, okay. So, but we'll be coming back to all these issues.
Okay.
And just to like, of course, we're going to talk about this mostly from an ethical perspective, but just to point out here um the what's at stake metaphysically, so to speak. This is a passage from Plotinus 592, which is about nous and the forms. And here he talks about virtue. And so part of the metaphysical argument going up from uh, forms, going up from the soul to the nous, depends on nous as a source of virtue, right? So do you want to read this passage?
Okay. From the beginning, the
Yeah.
pattern giving beauty to the corporeal rests upon it as idea to its matter, and the substrate may change and from being pleasant become distasteful, a sign in all reason that the beauty comes by participation. Again, the pattern, yeah, okay. Now, what is this that gives grace or beauty, okay, to the corporeal? Two causes in their degree, their participation in beauty and the power of soul, the maker, which has imprinted that form. We ask, then, is soul of itself a thing of beauty? We find that it is not, since differences are manifest. One soul wise and lovely, another foolish and ugly. So the soul, which is the level above matter right here, isn't actually beautiful, or not necessarily beautiful. Some souls are not beautiful. Soul beauty is constituted by wisdom. The question thus becomes, what principle is the giver of wisdom to the soul? And the only answer is the intellectual principle, or nous, the veritably intellectual, wise without intermission, and therefore beautiful of itself, because beauty means intellectual somehow. But does even this suffice for our first? No. We must look still inward beyond the intellectual, which, from our point of approach, stands before the supreme beginning. Meaning, nous is the supreme beginning here, and the first is even before that, and whose forecourt, as it were, it announces its own being, and announces in its own being the entire content of the good, that prior of all lacked in unity, all of which this is the expression already touched by multiplicity. Again, the sentences here don't make sense. That's the only problem.
Okay.
Um,
So,
and it's saying
um,
beyond the intellectual.
right. So beyond the intellectual, um, so the intellectual stands before the supreme beginning, the very first thing, and it stands it as it were in the forecourt, right? So the idea is there's an analogy here to a temple where you have the inner sanctuary and you have the forecourt, and and the intellect is as it were in the forecourt, not in the sanctuary of the temple, but in the forecourt, announcing the good and what's in it. But the good is really the ultimate good.
Oh, okay.
So the point here is that there are a couple of points here. First of all, is that the virtue of soul is supposed to be what explains that it can then produce beauty in the world. And so the virtue of soul has a cosmological function of producing beauty, and in case of beauty, order, right? So why is there an ordered cosmos? That's part of the question behind of, where does virtue come from? And also nous, right? So um, Plotinus develops this idea of nous as this principle of knowledge and order that makes itself known. But nous originally, I've come back to this a couple of times, but it always bears repeating, means uh, is a name for a virtue, right? It's a name for the knowledge that good people have, right? Why do virtuous people, why do good people, why are they able to know what's the right thing to do and how to do it and to do it? That knowledge is nous, right? So nous is sometimes used as a synonym for Sophia. And so that's a bit about like what's metaphysically at stake in the background behind this question of what are the virtues or what makes a soul virtuous, right? So the soul has this cosmological function of giving order to things, because the perceptible world is a changing world, and therefore the structure of this world is given by the sources of change, and the sources of change will be self-moving things, aka souls. And so, the quality of souls will impact the quality of the world. So virtue has this role. Um, and so there's that, and on the other hand, there's this question, that nous itself is in some sense, a virtue that exists on its own. So let's now go to the background from Plato. Okay, let's just look at these passages. So this is the passage that Plotinus quotes at the beginning of the of On Virtues. It's this passage on becoming like God. It's from a digression in the Theaetetus that interpreters have difficulty understanding. I mean, there are different options of how to understand why there's this digression, but it's a digression about what's the proper philosophical life. And it's a digression because it's not about the main subject of the Theaetetus, which is what is knowledge, right? And then Theodorus has just said something like, well, Socrates, if everyone behaved the way you're recommending, the world would be much better and there'd be no evil. And Socrates replies, but it is not possible, Theodorus, that evil should be destroyed, for there must always be something opposed to the good. Nor is it possible that it should have its seat in heaven, but it must inevitably haunt human life and prowl about this earth. That's the um, uh, thing about that was translated by haunting by a necessary law or circulating by the different translators, by Gerson and McKenna. That is why man should make all haste to escape from earth to heaven. And escape means becoming as like God as possible. And a man becomes like God when he becomes just and pious, with understanding. It is not at all an easy matter, my good friend, to persuade men that it is not for the reasons commonly alleged that one should try to escape from wickedness and pursue virtue. It is not in order to avoid a bad reputation and obtain a good one that virtue should be practiced and not vice. That, it seems to me, is only what men call old wives' talk. Right. So this is um right. So he's saying, you should pursue virtue because it's good in itself and because it assimilates you to God. He's going to make this, in the digression, he goes on to make this point about how um, there, there are two paradigms. There's, the divine paradigm and there's the totally chaotic paradigm. And the point of why virtue is good is that it makes you closer to the divine paradigm. And being wicked makes you closer to the totally chaotic one and ugly one. So you want to be like the beautiful one. This is one of the reasons that this digression causes a problem for interpreters, is that this talk of paradigm sounds a lot like forms. But he elsewhere doesn't talk about the forms in this dialogue about knowledge, which is then also a weird thing. So that's the thing. But anyway, so this is, as it were, the programmatic text that Plotinus takes at the beginning of his treatise. And um, as you see, like the question is how to escape by virtue, right? So that's something that, like we have the titles were given by Porphyry. And it's not always clear that the titles that Porphyry gave are actually the best titles that really represent things. By calling this text on virtue, he's put it in a line of many other texts and ancient texts, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily what Plotinus's main concern here is. So like one way to think about what Plato's main concern is here is like how to escape. What does escape mean, right? That would be a different way of that could be a different possible title, and that would lead to maybe other readers of Plotinus. Now, this idea of coming like God isn't just in the Theaetetus, and I want to look at a couple of different texts on this. So it shows up here also in the Republic, right? So then the philosopher, by consorting with what is ordered and divine, and despite all the slanders around that say otherwise, himself becomes as divine and ordered as a human being can. That's absolutely true. So don't you also agree that the harshness the majority exhibits toward philosophy is caused by those outsiders who don't belong and who burst in like a band of revelers, always abusing one another, indulging their love of quarrels, and arguing about human beings in a way that is wholly inappropriate to philosophy? I do indeed. No one whose thoughts are truly directed towards the things that are adamantous has the leisure to look down at human affairs or to be filled with envy and hatred by competing with people. Instead, as he looks at and studies things that are organized and always the same, that neither do injustice to one another nor suffer it, being all in a rational order, he imitates them and tries to become as like them as he can. Or do you think that someone can consort with the things he admires without imitating them? I do not. It's impossible. So here, again, there's this idea of um, you um, contemplate the divine things and you become divine. Through that, you become more ordered. You contemplate things that are always ordered and you become ordered. And the context here is a bit of addressing Adeimantus's disbelief that, philosophers can rule, right? And he's saying, well, no, look, if you think about what we mean by philosopher, these people should be excellent rulers, right? But the problem is that you're thinking of, these guys down the street that are always arguing, but that's not actually a philosopher. And we can think about how we can go into like how seriously we can possibly take this, because philosophers appear to still be those guys down the street that are arguing.
Right. This would be
Uh,
the people that has Sophia, not the philosophia people.
yeah.
Less
And
critics.
Yeah. And also, but so this is like another text that's behind this. It's connected with the Theaetetus text because there's also in the subsequent passage talk about contemplating this divine paradigm. And it's an important passage for Plotinus because this actually also encapsulates his criticism, or one criticism he has of Stoics. and with regard to virtue, because as you see here, Plato says the philosopher, he becomes a better person because he studies things that are entirely, at peace and that don't do injustice to each other. But the Stoic sage, what does he do? He studies physics. So he studies things that are constantly doing injustice to each other from the Platonic point of view, right? Of course, the Stoic will say the divine plan is perfect. And part of studying physics, studying astrology as part of physics as well, is for you to see that all this awful stuff, your house burning down, your city being flooded, plagues, wars, this is all actually necessary and beautiful and good. Whereas for the Platonist, all these kinds of destruction and generation from destruction that are characterized by the natural world, these are things that are doing injustice to each other. And for you to have a firm basis for virtue, you need to know things that are themselves entirely stable. And those are the forms, right? So Plotinus in 591 compares the Epicureans to birds that are flightless. They're like chickens. They eat from the ground, and so they have lots of earth in them. And they think that their whole life is earthy. So they think that their life is about pain and pleasure. The the Stoics, they can even fly, right? But they have nowhere to settle down. And so they come back to earth because they know that there's more to life than pain and pleasure. They tell their readers, think about yourself, think who you are, right? Flee the multitude, turn to yourself, know what's in your power and what's not, but they have no content to this life. Or when they do give content to this life, it's turning back to the world, turning back to physics. The the Platonist, then Plotinus says, is like the philosopher, or is like then it's not even like a bird, or rather, it's like a being with these magical wings that brings it all the way to its homeland, right? That's going back to the Phaedrus, and also going back to Odysseus, right? The philosopher is like Odysseus who returns to Ithaca. Um, so so that's also behind this becoming like a god, and this emphasis on becoming like a god then has at least it has this Platonic background that has some of this polemical edge. But it's not just Plato. So the idea comes up also in Aristotle. So this is in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, right? And so it's about how happiness is contemplative activity, right? And he connects this with the idea of living a divine life. That complete happiness is a contemplative activity will appear from the following considerations as well. We assume the gods to be above all other beings, blessed and happy. But what sort of actions must we assign to them? Acts of justice? Will not the gods seem absurd if they make contracts and return deposits and so on? Acts of a brave man, then, confronting dangers and running risks because it is noble to do so? Or liberal acts? To whom will they give? It will be strange if they are really to have money or anything of the kind. And what would their temperate acts be? Is not such praise tasteless, since they have no bad appetites? If we were to run through them all, the circumstances of action would be found trivial and unworthy of gods. Still, everyone supposes that they live, and therefore that they are active. We cannot suppose them to sleep like Endymion. Now, if you take away from a living being action, and still more production, what is left but contemplation? Therefore, the activity of God, which surpasses all others in blessedness, must be contemplative. And of human beings, therefore, that which is most akin to this must be most of the nature of happiness. Right? So here, Aristotle raises a question that Plotinus will deal with on virtue, which is what virtues do any, if any, do the gods have? Right? And um, and so he says, it makes no sense to attribute to them moral virtues at all. And um, And then he also ends by, and this is part of then that argues that um, the divine life is a contemplative life, and therefore our contemplative life will be um, uh, a life of assimilation to the gods, right? And it goes back to this by arguing that the man who contemplates is dearest, most loved by the gods. For if the gods have any care for human affairs, this is a big if, right? Many interpreters of Aristotle will deny this. As they are thought to have, it would be reasonable both that they should delight in that which was best and most akin to them, that is, intellect, and that they should reward those who love and honor this most, as caring for the things that are dear to them and acting both rightly and nobly, and that all these attributes belong most of all to the wise man is manifest. He therefore is the dearest to the gods, and he who is uh, that will presumably also be happiest, so that in this way too the wise man will more than any other be happy. So this theme, although it becomes something of a Platonist slogan to talk about assimilation to God as likeness to God as an objective of human life. You see, there's also Aristotelian background here to this idea. Um, okay, and another idea that we saw already in these first 10 lines of the On Virtue is that he names a specific God, right? The soul of the cosmos, right? The world, right? Or maybe the part of it which governs. That would be its intellect, right? And also the term you here use for the part of it which governs or the principle ruling within it is the hegemonikon, which is a Stoic term for the ruling part of the soul. And so it would be this it's reason or wisdom, right? That controls the perfectly virtuous soul of the world. And again, there's a Platonic background to this. Plato emphasizes in Timaeus that the world is perfectly happy and that we become happy by imitating it. So that's here in Timaeus 34b. He talks about how it's virtuous. So can you read this passage?
Okay. Applying this entire train of reasoning to the God that was yet to be, the eternal God made it smooth and even all over, equal from the center, a whole and complete body itself. This is the sphere, but also made up of complete bodies. In its center, he set a soul, which he extended throughout the whole body, and with which he then covered the body outside. And he set it to turn in a circle, a single solitary universe whose very excellence enables it to keep its own company without requiring anything else. For its knowledge of and friendship with itself is enough. All this then explains why this world, which he begat for himself, is a blessed God.
Right. The place of this passage is precisely when he finishes talking about the body of the world, and then now he's going to talk about the construction of the world soul. And um, so yeah, so he talks about how this is how this God is happy, and also he emphasizes the problem about, or rather, he brings up the problem that it's alone, right? And this was something that Aristotle talked about, how um, we would always prefer to have friends than not to have friends, right? So we think that having friends, having friendship is part of what makes a good life. And he says, well, it keeps company with itself, right? There's also Plato is, engaged in other debates here. Part of this is like, as it were, absorbing themes from Empedocles. This is the showing that this world that exists now is a realization of love, and so it's entirely in love with itself and united with itself. But anyway, so this is him stating that the world is virtuous and happy. And then later on, he comes to about how sight is like the greatest gift of the gods because it lets us first of all see that there's a change of day and night, and this leads to development of mathematics and eventually to philosophy. Right? And so he's talking things that sight has given let us know. Day and night of months and years of equinoxes and solstices has led to the invention of number, has given us the idea of time, and opened the path to inquiry into the nature of the universe. These pursuits have given us philosophy, a gift from the gods to the mortal race, whose value neither has been nor ever will be surpassed. I am quite prepared to declare this to be the supreme good our eyesight offers us. Why then should we exalt all the lesser good things, which a non-philosopher struck blind would lament and bewail in vain? Let us rather declare that the cause and purpose of this supreme good is this. The God invented sight and gave it to us so that we might observe the orbits of intelligence in the universe and apply them to the revolutions of our own understanding. There is a kinship between them, even though our revolutions are disturbed, whereas the universal orbits are undisturbed. So once we have come to know them and to share in the ability to make correct calculations according to nature, we should stabilize the straying revolutions within ourselves by imitating the completely unstraying revolutions of the God. So here again, it ends with the idea of assimilation to God. And it's a very specific kind of assimilation. So the world is a perfect and happy being. We have the same kind of structure. However, the circles of the soul are bent out of shape, right? And they're not circulating properly. So by looking up and doing astronomy and philosophy, we seeing how the world is ordered and adapting ourselves to that cosmic order, we can order our lives to the world's order and therefore become happy, right? And that's the idea. So Timaeus himself proposes the world as a model, and so this is the beginning uh, of On Virtue. Now, there's a little bit more of background before we continue, before we jump into the text, because I want to give the background that's behind um, at least the first chapter. So one thing that we're going to come across is a distinction between political and philosophical virtue. And that's going to become really, so this is like really crucial for the whole idea of a ladder of the virtues. And of course, the ladder scale of the virtues, when we get to that, we'll go back to the text. But that goes back to the ladder of love in the symposium, right? But here, there's a distinction between political and philosophical virtue in the Phaedo, when he's talking about the fates of different souls, right? And then he says that the happiest of these, so these non-philosophers, who will have the best destination, are those who have practiced popular and social virtue. Social here is a translation of politikos, right? So it's a political, which they call moderation and justice, and which was developed by habit and practice without philosophy or understanding. How are they happiest? Because it is likely that they will again join a social and gentle group, either of bees or wasps or ants, and then again the same kind of human group, and so be moderate men. That is likely. No one may join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy and is not completely pure when he departs from life. No one but the lover of learning. It is for this reason, my friends Simmias and Cebes, that those who practice philosophy in the right way keep away from all bodily passions, master them, and do not surrender themselves to them. It is not at all for fear of wasting their substance and of poverty, which the majority and the many lovers fear, nor for fear of dishonor and ill repute, like the ambitious and lovers of honors, that they keep away from them. That would not be natural for them, Socrates, said Cebes. By Zeus, no, he said. Those who care for their own soul and do not live for the service of their body dismiss all these things. They do not travel the same road as those who do not know where they are going, but believing that nothing should be done contrary to philosophy and their deliverance and purification, they turn to this and follow wherever philosophy leads. So, a couple of notes here. Here, political virtue, right, popular and social virtue, seems to be associated with doing things without knowing the reason for them, right? He contrasts it with a philosopher who knows why he does things, right? And he says that they were developed by habit and practice without philosophy or understanding. So that's not necessarily going to be the case going on. Like Neoplatonists won't say that political virtue is not the a an understanding virtue. Rather, it's the virtue also, which is also a connotation from here, that's good for living in a city, right? And it's contrasted here with the philosophical life as described in the Phaedo, which is not a city life, right? Which is one of hating the body and separating yourself from it and denying yourself things and um and so on. There's he there is a question here about the why you do things that's important. So um uh Socrates. He says that those who practice philosophy in the right way, they keep away from all bodily passions, they master them, do not surrender themselves to them, and they do it for the love of their own soul, right? So part of having a virtue is doing things for the right reason. So if you're honest just because you think honesty is best policy, that's not having the virtue, because the virtue is some in a like decision. It's not a decision. It's a disposition to do things to not only do certain things in certain situations, but to do them also for certain reasons. And that's a point that's made here, and that then goes into the um, tradition. And it's also why, for instance, you'll be able to say, for instance, that there's a political version of courage where you face fears because you want to uh, dominate. Like your passions should obey what reason tells you, and there's a higher purificatory version of courage, which has to do with you face fears because you know that your true identity is your soul and you're not your body. And but this idea of a political virtue also comes up in the Republic, which is where later Platonists will say is like the classic location for the political virtues. So here in Republic 430, and so Uh, here he talks about what courage is, right? This power to preserve through everything the correct and law inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what isn't is what I call courage, unless, of course, you say otherwise. I have nothing different to say, for I assume that you don't consider the correct belief about these things, which you find in animals and slaves, and which is not the result of education, to be inculcated by law, and that you don't call it courage but something else. That's absolutely true. So, if it's not, if it doesn't have knowledge accompanying it, it's not courage. Then I accept your account of courage. And then he um, correct him. Accept it instead as my account of civic courage, right? Political courage. And you will be right. We'll discuss courage more fully some other time, if you like. They never get back to this. But Plato himself is pointing to, there are different courages, right? So this is civic courage, right? And so that's it for the background of um, Plotinus 1, 1, 2, 1. And we can
Hmm.
start reading it now.
So two things. Is there
Sure.
something what we just read, the last two things, the Plato, Socrates seems to say that's it's political virtue if it's for the sake of reputation or something like that, and the philosophical virtue is for the sake of something else. Like, is the like intention the problem, or like you don't really have courage, you just want to have a good name or something like that?
Right. So here in the Republic, it's not that it's for the sake of being it doesn't say that it's for the sake of reputation. He um he he says, and he doesn't really contrast it with true philosophical courage, what courage itself is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he um, just says, I guess here that what marks it out as perhaps civic is that it's a oh, wait, sorry, is that it's a law inculcated belief, right? Correct and law inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what isn't, right? So there's this um, inherent um, reference to the education that you have in the city and the laws that govern it, right? So that's the um, um, that really marks out this courage as civic.
Hmm.
This, but here he says that it's not just right opinion, right? It has to be the result of education, right? And whereas in the previous slide, um, it seems to be it was developed by habit and practice without philosophy or understanding. So here, and here he's talking about political virtue in general. And so here he seems to say that the other ones they don't know why they do it. Um, so there are different views in the Phaedo and the Republic, and Platonists will have to deal with this.
Okay.
Um, okay, so that's it for slides today.
Yeah.
Why don't we
Where's our
start reading
thing?
the text?
Yeah. Another random question. Is there a pre-Platonic source, pre-Platonic source for the idea of assimilating to a god or being like God, or is
Hmm.
that something that Plato made up?
There's there's the opposite, right? There's the idea of don't try to be like a god, right?
Right.
Remember, you are a human being. You are mortal. You're not a god. If you try to act like a god, it ends up badly for us. The gods are jealous, right, of their prerogatives. And a lot of what Plato does is opposed to that, right? So he says, you have an immortal soul, right? You have this immortal psyche. There's something divine in you. You should try to become like the gods. The gods, um, nothing divine is jealous. He says this in the Timaeus, right? So he goes against many of these previous ideas about the separate place of gods and mortals.
Hmm.
If there is also, however, if there is something previous to him about becoming like a god, there are stories about Hercules becoming a god, right? And there are stories about people being elevated to godhood, like individual heroes and so on. Um, but the um, but as like this general moral prescription, become like a god, I think it's something quite. I mean, there might be like an Orphic or Pythagorean source here, but I'm not sure.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, okay, so you wanna start reading?
Yes. Since let me start from the beginning, right? Since evil is here, haunting this world by necessary law, or you said not by law, by something, and it is the soul's design to escape from evil, we must escape hence. Okay, but what is this escape? So escape could have been just going somewhere else, but that's not what it means.
Right,
Um, for now.
right. So in the Theaetetus passage, he does use the this kind of at first he uses this spatial metaphor, right? Escaping from earth to heaven, right? So later he explains it as assimilating yourself to the divine paradigm. But here, so there is a question of like, what is the escape? Yeah.
Okay. I mean, at some point you can
Oh,
die and go to heaven literally or something.
right. That's also a question, right? Of course, is this escape death? And in the Phaedo starts with this question about why don't we just kill ourselves? And Socrates brings this story about how we are, as it were, prisoners in this life, and the prisoner doesn't get to choose when he dies.
Right. But then there would be such, according to that, there would be such an escape. It's just not proper. That's from the opposite virtue of like knowing your place.
Right, exactly. And actually, so like the full Platonist account would be, I mean, I'm not sure that they would have like if you kill yourself out of despair because you have just too strong passions, you won't have solved your passions, of course, and so you'll be in more. You won't have escaped.
Right.
You've just deprived yourself of the possibility of meeting Socrates.
Right. Only if you let the city kill you lawfully, like Socrates, then. Um, but what is this escape? Or in war, like they have, right, we have the courage where you should be
Right.
courageous because dying is no big a deal. In attaining, okay, but what is this escape? So besides for that escape or the escape that we want to talk about, it's in attaining likeness to God, we read. The Garrison has a problem with the word likeness. I didn't get what they want. They want to say
Uh,
assimilation always because likeness means something wrong. I don't know.
right.
Um,
You can, yeah, I guess also because like here, assimilation translates both as attaining and likeness, right? It's one word of
mhm.
both.
Okay.
But
Yeah, but it means becoming like, or
yeah, so
and this is explained. And what is how do you become like to God, like God, right? So that's
mhm.
another question, right? Because we could be like God in many ways. Like God is well, depending what God we're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
But God
Also,
can be
yeah.
many things. And when people say, or when Plato says becoming like God, he explains that it means becoming just and holy, living by wisdom. The entire nature, or the entire, I forgot what you said, the whole grounded in virtue. So, in some sense, it's not literal in this, like you could say becoming like God by being immortal, which maybe is the end, anyways. But again, more specifically, becoming like God by being virtuous.
Right. And so virtue is a means to becoming like God, which is a means of escape. Right. Um, and right. So one of he translates the entire like the Greek says something like and generally in virtue. So you can translate it like, and it's not really clear what the in virtue is connected to. So it, he did this, what I just translated as generally or wholly, he did the entire nature. So that would be he's taking like the becoming, so like becoming wholly in virtue. That's how he's taking it. I guess that's possible. But anyway, I think what Plotinus is doing is he's generalizing because um, Plato names some specific virtues, justice and piety, right? And
Okay.
understanding, if you want it, or wisdom here for phronesis. And he's just generalizing, it's virtue. That's his interpretation. He's not going to give us, and indeed, that's how the text goes on. He doesn't give us, as it were, an interpretation of these specific virtues, which
Hmm.
might, another interpreter might go that way.
Okay. Is there a question of being like God in a non-virtuous way, like we discussed, like in a uh, like
So,
God is not, or is that something that like is Plato like when we say become like God, be virtuous? I guess the question is which one is first? Is it that we're trying to be like God and just the best way or the only way we figured out to do that was to be virtuous? Or is it that we're trying to find reasons for you to be virtuous and we say, well, God is virtuous, so you should be virtuous?
well, science will enter into this question about whether we can possibly say that God is virtuous.
Right.
And also just a thing that I want to say before. So here, attaining likeness to God. Of course, the more strict translation would be to attain likeness to a God, right? Because there's also in the Greek, there's no definite article, and so it's not uh, it, in general, there's no monotheist background for us to use a capital G for a singular God. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Um, Okay, so and is there a background of like becoming like a god in other ways? I mean, sure there are myths about this. So like but where it's, but then it's just mythical, like where you become like a god because you drink in the potion of immortality, right? And things like that.
Mm.
Um, or where people are so beautiful that they're beautiful like a god, or they challenge the gods to do like to say, I sing better than the muses, I play pipes better than Apollo, right? There's that kind of assimilation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
which has to do again with actually, like these things you can say, these are also competitions of excellence. And so those are also about virtue, but of course it's not the virtue that the philosophers are interested in. It's not the kind of excellence. It's not excellence in living, right? I guess that's the point. So being beautiful or playing the pipes or singing, it's not excellence in how to live, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hey. Okay, so this is how. But now we got to the question until here is like summarizing what Plato said. But does not likeness by way of virtue imply likeness to some being that has virtue, right? Because you're going to be like God or a God um, by being virtuous. That means that should imply that the God has virtue. Now we have a question: to what divine being then would our likeness be? So which one? Which God? And then we have like a proposal to answer the question. To the being must we not think, in which above all such excellence seems to inhere. Such excellence meaning, let's think of the God closest to what we call virtue, which is in orderly life or something like that. Um, that is the soul of the cosmos and to the principle ruling within it. And that principle endowed with a wisdom most wonderful. What could be more fitting than that we living in this world would become like to its ruler? Okay, so that would be the answer. Is that the answer is going to stay with?
right.
Um,
It's not the answer it's going to stay with, but that's an initial answer, right? One initial answer is that we become like like the world or its ruler. And why think that this is what is most endowed with virtue? Well, if what we're looking is for virtue, we mean excellence in living, then then the world is the great living being of which all other living beings are parts. So it is the one that lives best, right?
mhm.
That's one thing, and that's also like a premise that Stoic here listeners would agree to. So that's part that might be part of the thing he's drawing on, also like a typical Stoic first answer. We assimilate this. So also, because that was also part of the Stoic definitions of happiness, that part of it is living according to nature, right? So living according to the law of the world, right? To Zeus. Um, so
Okay, so
that's
since likeness, we want to likeness by virtue means the thing where being like has virtue,
yeah.
and that seems to be the world soul, since
Mhm.
that is the one who seems to have virtue or seems to have um
The
mm,
most virtue, right?
yeah, and is the ruler of, and another thing would be that, or maybe the same thing, that it's the ruler of the world and we live in the world.
Right. And also, um, right, and he varies between two options here, right? There's the soul of the cosmos or the principle ruling within.
Hmm.
So that so in the English it's not clear, but ruling within it is within the soul, right? It's not the cosmos. And so it might be like the nous of the soul of the cosmos. Right? That's the other option he entertains.
Hmm. And the and that would be closer to the living in the world, so we should become like its ruler, or
Yeah. And he says also that this wisdom is most wonderful. Um, Let me get this. So that's thaumaste. So it causes wonder, and so part of this, I guess, is also, the wonder of the wisdom of the world is, the what no when the Timaeus said that the world is beautiful. This how all the celestial cycles and the natural cycles all line up together, and so there's some kind of evidence of cosmic wisdom here.
hmm. Okay, but we have a question, a problem. But at the beginning, we're met by the doubt whether even this divine being all the virtues find place. So all mean really any, and then it's not like, or maybe some, yes, not sure. Um,
Right. But also, we even if it has some but not all, then will we, uh will should we just not have those? Right? That's a question.
hmm
So like he's gonna say that he's gonna argue about both like self-control. Doesn't have self-control because it doesn't have passions, and it doesn't have courage because it doesn't have things to fear.
hmm
So, but let's say that it just doesn't have those two, but it still has wisdom and justice. But then
Right.
for us, should we just pursue wisdom and justice and ignore self-control and courage?
hmm Okay, but at the beginning, well, we could always say, okay, we'll see. But at the beginning, we are met by the doubt whether, even in this divine being, all the virtues find place. So, moral balance, sophrosyne, I don't know, that's just the word for temperance, right?
Yeah, temperance,
For
self-control.
example, or fortitude, or which is courage, I think. Where so there can't be the both of these things, where there can be no danger since nothing is alien. So the world soul has no enemies since it's the only thing that exists, or at least in this world, then there's nothing against it to fear and therefore have courage towards. And where there can be nothing alluring, whose lack could induce the desire of possession, it also is missing nothing. So nothing would entice it. Would have to exercise the virtue of how do you call it, self-control or temperance.
Yeah. Um, Two things. So these are actually points that the point that there's nothing outside it, right? So the alien in the text is originally outside. That's a point made in the Timaeus, right? He quite explicitly makes this that there's nothing outside the world. And this is important, and also Stoics hold this. For both Stoics and Platonists, it's important because it's a reply to the materialists, right? The materialists think that there's atoms and void outside the world. The Stoics believe in void outside the world, but they don't think that it's not a being. The only beings are bodies for Stoics. And the Stoics think that there has to be void outside the world because when it becomes a ball of fire, fire is less dense than earth, and so it's going to occupy more space. Um, and But in any case, the um yeah, so that's what the fortitude is. The thing that it doesn't have anything future, like anything to entice it, is it has no lack, is curious. And that kind of points to the fact that he might just be thinking about the nous, right? Because it doesn't seem true about the soul. This is something that Plotinus makes another point Plotinus makes about the other texts, and that's from the Symposium. Insofar as we are in time, we have what is present to us, and we always desire, even if we have a good thing, we still desire the good thing because we desire it to continue being ours. And so beings in time always have a desire for the future, for at least, even if they're in a perfectly happy state, they want that state to stay and to continue. But if there is nothing, if it doesn't lack anything really, then we have to be talking about something that's not in time, right? So that it's probably not the soul of the world, but the nous of the world. Like
The govern.
it yeah, it's intellect, and then also the idea that there's nothing alien or nothing outside it can mean not just physically that there's nothing outside it, but that it contains everything because it knows everything. It has the ideas of all things in it. So we're at 5:30 already.
Yeah, okay.
So let's stop here, but we'll pick up from here next week, okay?
Yes. Okay, that was very good beginning.
Yeah, I'm glad we started
Okay.
again.
Thank you. See you next week, right? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, see you next week.